As the cold winds howl across the rolling hills, the stone walls of a medieval castle stand tall and unyielding. Their imposing structure, tall towers, narrow windows, and thick walls, was designed to defend against invaders, not to offer comfort. Yet, as the frigid embrace of winter enveloped the world outside, those same walls would soon become merciless traps for the castle's inhabitants. With snow piling up outside, the interior of the castle would plunge into an icy stillness. The halls, vast and cavernous, would echo with the sound of wind and the occasional creaking of timber. The flickering light from the torches barely reached the corners, leaving many rooms in near total darkness, except for the rare glimmer from a hearth. In the harshest months, the castle would feel less like a fortress and more like a frozen prison. The cold seeped into every crack and crevice, making even the most opulent rooms feel unbearable. Yet, in the heart of this looming fortress, there was one place that could still offer warmth, comfort, and a sense of safety: the kitchen. The kitchen was far more than a place where food was prepared. It was, in many ways, the lifeblood of the castle during the brutal winter months, the one room that could offer both warmth and nourishment. While the rest of the castle may have felt like a grim fortress, the kitchen stood as a beacon of hope. The significance of the kitchen in a medieval castle, particularly during the cold winter months, cannot be overstated. It was the epicenter of survival, where fire, food, and human ingenuity converged to combat the relentless chill. It was the only place where the necessary warmth to sustain life could be found, and even more crucially, it was the place where food could be prepared in the face of starvation. The reality of medieval life was often harsh, but the kitchen provided a level of resilience. It was there that the ability to endure winter's worst was fostered. What many don't realize, however, is that the kitchen's role in a medieval castle was about much more than just food. The preservation of life itself often rested in the hands of the people working in these kitchens. The kitchen was a microcosm of medieval ingenuity, a place where the entire castle depended on its resources for survival. In these kitchens, carefully tended fires provided warmth for both cooking and heating, while the skillful preservation of food allowed families and inhabitants to weather long periods without access to fresh produce. What often goes unnoticed is how strategically important these kitchens were to a castle's survival. A castle could withstand an external siege, but if the cold of winter crept inside and depleted the resources needed to sustain its people, that could prove far more deadly than any invading army. The kitchen, therefore, was not just a place where meals were made. It was a refuge, a haven in the midst of cold and hardship. The ability to preserve food through salting, smoking, and drying was as important as any weapon stored within the armory. Food had to be carefully preserved in autumn so that the inhabitants would not face famine during the bitter winter months. It wasn't just about the food either. Fire was a necessity in every medieval castle kitchen. The hearth was the single most important feature, not only for cooking but also for heating. Every castle kitchen relied on open hearths, large enough to roast entire animals or to heat cauldrons filled with stew. These fires were a constant presence, not only providing warmth but also offering light in the castle's otherwise dark interior. The workers in the kitchen, most of whom were peasant servants, spent long hours tending the fire, keeping it alive through the long nights. They understood that without the fire, the castle would become uninhabitable. Without a proper hearth, the stone walls would turn the castle into a cold and empty shell. As the winter months drew nearer, the urgency around the kitchen grew. The kitchen itself was no longer just a place of food production, it was a survival mechanism. The people who worked in the kitchen would spend days preparing for winter, preserving meats, drying vegetables, and ensuring that there were enough supplies to last through the darkest months. When the snow fell and the cold winds howled, these preparations became vital. The kitchen was no longer a room for mere convenience. It was a space where life itself was preserved. It was where the castle would find its warmth, not just from the fire, but from the work and effort put in by those who kept the hearth burning. At the same time, it was important to understand that the kitchen was not a solitary room within the castle. It was connected to the wider functioning of the entire estate. Everything in a castle relied on the resources and labor that flowed through the kitchen. The kitchen was a network of activity, with cooks, servants, and stock keepers all working together to ensure that the castle's needs were met. While the lord and lady of the castle may have lived in relative comfort, it was the hard work of those in the kitchen that made that comfort possible. In many ways, the kitchen was a symbol of the resilience and self-sufficiency of medieval life. While the world outside might have seemed chaotic and unpredictable, the kitchen remained a constant, a place where fire and food could keep the castle alive. The importance of the kitchen in ensuring survival was so critical that it extended beyond just winter months. It was an essential part of the everyday functioning of the castle. But it was particularly during the winter, when food was scarce and the cold could easily overwhelm, that the kitchen's role truly came into focus. As we journey through the history of the medieval castle and the critical role played by its kitchen, we'll uncover more about this unsung hero. From its humble origins to the complex systems that kept it running smoothly, we'll explore how the kitchen became not only the heart of the castle but the key to its survival. Through the struggle for warmth and food, we will see how ingenuity, hard work, and determination shaped the very foundation of life in the medieval world. The castle kitchen, often overlooked in historical narratives, is the true symbol of perseverance, ingenuity, and the will to survive against all odds. The landscape outside a medieval castle was, during the winter months, a world of extremes. Imagine standing on the parapet of a towering stone fortress, gazing across a snow-covered plain. The wind is sharp, biting through your cloak and stinging your skin. The sun, low in the sky, offers little warmth. The earth, frozen beneath a thick layer of snow, seems as though it might never thaw. The world outside the castle walls was a hostile environment, a constant battle against the elements. But it wasn't just the cold that made medieval winters so perilous. It was a combination of factors: the brutal weather, the lack of modern comforts, and the limitations of medieval technology. Medieval winters were unpredictable, but they were almost always extreme. In some regions of Europe, particularly in the north, winters could stretch from October through to March. And in those months, the cold was not simply an inconvenience. It could be deadly. Castles, built from thick stone walls that were designed to withstand siege weapons and arrows, were poorly equipped to deal with the bitter cold. While the thick walls might have been able to keep out intruders, they offered little insulation against the chill of winter. Inside the castle, the temperature often mirrored that of the world outside, particularly in the grand halls and chambers where cold air seeped through cracks and crevices. The lack of central heating meant that the inhabitants of a medieval castle had to be constantly vigilant about keeping warm. Fireplaces, while essential, were limited in their effectiveness. They could warm a room, but not an entire castle. And when the cold winds howled outside, they often found their way through the smallest of gaps, turning the interior into a drafty, uncomfortable space. Only a few rooms in the castle would have any kind of reliable warmth, often those that were closest to the hearths or kitchens. These rooms, like the Great Hall or the Lord's private chambers, would be warmer, but only by a degree or two. For the rest of the castle's inhabitants, the cold was a constant, oppressive presence. For the servants, soldiers, and other lower-ranking members of the castle's population, the winter months were especially harsh. They often lived in the colder parts of the castle, away from the warmth of the hearths, where the cold was more pronounced. Their rooms were likely little more than crude stone cells with minimal protection from the elements. They had to bundle up in layers of rough cloth and wool to keep from freezing during the long nights. The contrast between the lord and lady's warm quarters and the freezing conditions faced by the servants was stark. Even for those living in better conditions, winter was not a time of comfort. The sheer physical toll of living through these cold months was immense. The food situation, too, was dire during winter. Fresh food, grown in the summer and fall, had long since been depleted or preserved. There were no grocery stores to turn to, no easy way to replenish supplies. Instead, the castle's residents had to rely on what they had stored, often in the form of salted meats, dried grains, and other preserved foods. The kitchen was tasked with making the most of these meager supplies, stretching them out to ensure survival until the spring. But without the luxury of refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, even the stored food could be subject to spoilage, vermin, or disease. It wasn't just the cold that posed a threat to survival. The lack of fresh, nutritious food could lead to malnutrition and illness. But what was perhaps most unsettling about the medieval winter was the ever-present threat of starvation. The food stored in the castle was limited, and as the cold months wore on, supplies began to dwindle. In the absence of modern transportation, food shortages were common during the winter months, as supply lines were cut off by snow and ice. Castles had to be self-sufficient, and this was a constant struggle. The work of the castle's cooks and kitchen staff was a matter of life and death. They had to use every last scrap of food, every ounce of salt and preserved meat, to make sure that the castle's residents could survive until spring. For the common folk living outside the castle walls, the harshness of winter was even more acute. The peasants who worked the fields and tended the animals faced unimaginable hardships during these months. They lived in crude cottages, often with little more than a fire and a few blankets to protect them from the cold. Their food stores were limited, and without the protection of castle walls, they were vulnerable to the harsh weather, starvation, and disease. It was not uncommon for entire villages to be wiped out during particularly harsh winters, as the cold led to famine and outbreaks of illness. Many would die from hypothermia or malnutrition, with no one to help them. In the castles, the fear of starvation was always a looming threat. The servants and lower-ranking soldiers, who lived on meager rations, would often be the first to suffer when food became scarce. The cooks and kitchen staff had to be strategic in their use of food, ensuring that every scrap was used, every bit of preserved meat or grain was rationed carefully. The people working in the kitchen were often the unsung heroes of winter survival, their work vital to maintaining the castle's population. Without them, the cold would have claimed more lives. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, the psychological toll of winter was also felt in the castle. The isolation, the darkness, and the constant battle against the cold all took their toll on the minds of those who lived in the castle. The long winter nights were often filled with a sense of dread. Even the bravest knights and nobility could not escape the fact that they were vulnerable to the harshness of winter. The castle's imposing walls, which were meant to protect them from enemies, also kept them isolated from the outside world. The cold, relentless winter made them feel more vulnerable than any siege could. The psychological weight of winter was especially hard on the children and elderly living within the castle. For them, the bitter cold seemed unrelenting. The fire in the hearth offered little comfort against the constant shiver of the cold that clung to the stone walls. For the young and the old, the winter months felt like an eternity, one that could only be endured by the strength of the kitchen fire and the promise of the food it could provide. Even with all these hardships, winter had a strange kind of beauty. There was something undeniably awe-inspiring about the sight of a snow-covered landscape, the stark contrast of the white snow against the gray stone of the castle walls. There was an intimacy in the way the castle became a refuge against the harshness of the outside world. In the warmth of the kitchen and around the hearth, the inhabitants could find a brief respite from the cold, gathering together for meals and stories as they waited for spring to come. The kitchen and its hearth became the beating heart of the castle, a place where survival, warmth, and community could still be found, even in the midst of the harshest winter. When we think of medieval castles, we often imagine towering fortifications, battlements, and archers poised to defend against invaders. These monumental structures were designed to protect, to intimidate, and to withstand the most intense sieges and attacks. However, one aspect of their design that is rarely discussed is the profound vulnerability they faced in the unforgiving cold of winter. Despite their imposing appearance, medieval castles were not well equipped to handle the harsh temperatures of the colder months. They were fortresses meant to keep out enemies, not the cold, and as the temperature dropped, those within were subjected to a stark contrast between the protection their walls offered and the deep discomfort of the winter season. The basic design of medieval castles was both brilliant and flawed. At their core, castles were made of thick stone walls, ideal for defense. These stone walls could withstand arrows, battering rams, and siege engines with relative ease. However, stone is also an excellent conductor of cold. It may have been impenetrable to the weapons of enemy forces, but it was no match for the cold winds and icy temperatures that came with the changing seasons. Once winter arrived, the stone walls absorbed the cold from outside and radiated it inward, chilling the interior of the castle. Inside the castle, Rooms were large and often open, with high ceilings and minimal insulation. The great halls, where lords and ladies held court or feasted, were vast spaces, grand and beautiful, but ill-suited to the cold. While these halls were designed for spectacle and ceremony, they were also incredibly difficult to heat. The space was simply too large for a fire in the hearth to effectively warm the entire room. The problem was further compounded by the fact that medieval castles did not have windows as we know them today. Instead, they had small, narrow slits, designed to allow for archers to shoot at attackers while minimizing the amount of exposure to the outside elements. These narrow windows let in very little light, and even less heat, allowing cold air to pour in relentlessly. When the wind howled through these narrow openings, the interior of the castle would grow cold and uncomfortable. In contrast to the cold, impenetrable exterior and the drafty interior, the physical space of the castle was also largely unsuitable for the everyday activities required to survive the winter. Most castles were designed with the expectation that the inhabitants would have enough fuel to heat the building, but this was not always the case. While large hearths were located in the kitchen and great hall, keeping these fires burning was an enormous undertaking. It wasn't just a matter of stoking the flames regularly. Firewood had to be cut and stored in advance, and enough kindling had to be prepared to ensure that the flames would not go out during the night. In addition, the firewood itself was a limited resource. Castles were often located in regions where forests were either distant or carefully managed, meaning the fuel for heating could be scarce during the winter months. To further complicate matters, the size and shape of castles made them hard to heat evenly. A castle might have several floors, with narrow stairways and towering turrets that were difficult to access or maintain. Heating those upper floors, where the soldiers or servants would often reside, was nearly impossible without large, constant fires that would consume vast quantities of firewood. Even in the best of times, these upper chambers would be freezing, while the central courtyard and great hall might manage a semblance of warmth. But in the dead of winter, even the central parts of the castle could turn into bitterly cold rooms, filled with the drafts that made everyday life unbearable. The layout of the castle also posed another problem: the separation between spaces designed for defense and those designed for habitation. The fortress itself was divided into distinct areas, each serving a different function. The Great Hall, where important social events took place, was centrally located and often warmer due to the fire burning in the hearth. But the barracks, kitchens, and stables were spread out, some far removed from the central heating, and many rooms had no real access to fire. The kitchens, for example, were usually located in separate buildings, far away from the living quarters of the castle's lords. These buildings would be heated by open hearths, but the heat would not easily reach the living areas, especially in the colder months. The further away from the hearth a room was, the colder it would become. If a castle had multiple floors, the upper levels were often especially hard hit by the cold. Cold air would sink down into the lower chambers, while the warmth that the fire provided could not reach the top floors. The lord and lady of the castle might enjoy relative warmth in their private quarters, but servants and soldiers, relegated to colder rooms in the castle's turrets or towers, would shiver through the winter nights. It was a harsh and often perilous existence, as prolonged exposure to these temperatures could result in illness or even death. In fact, the combination of cold and dampness in castles was a serious threat to the health of their inhabitants. Dampness, particularly during the rainy and snowy seasons, could cause the stone walls of the castle to retain moisture, and once the cold set in, this moisture would freeze. The freezing of the walls would lead to more cracks and fissures, creating an even colder environment inside the castle. If these problems were not addressed, the cold could become unbearable, even dangerous. The health risks of living in such an environment were compounded by the lack of modern medicine and the absence of the comforts we take for granted today. Moreover, the isolation of castles exacerbated the difficulties posed by the winter months. While castles were meant to be self-sufficient, they were also often isolated in remote locations, sometimes miles away from the nearest town or village. With no easy access to outside resources, if a castle's stores of firewood or food ran low, there were few options for resupply during the winter. If roads were blocked by snow or ice, the castle's inhabitants might find themselves trapped until the thaw came, forced to make do with whatever food and resources they had on hand. In times of siege, when castles were under attack, the problem of winter became even more pronounced. If an enemy force managed to block off the supply lines or lay siege to the castle, the inhabitants would find themselves not only fighting for survival against their attackers but also against the ravaging effects of hunger and the cold. During these brutal periods, the castle's kitchens, hearths, and storerooms became the last bastions of hope, and every effort was made to preserve what little warmth and food could be maintained. In contrast to these grim realities, there were moments when the castle's cold, stark beauty shone through the harshness of winter. The sight of a medieval castle, standing proud against a backdrop of snow and ice, was awe-inspiring. The sheer scale of these fortresses, their towers piercing the sky, gave the impression of a place that could withstand anything, except perhaps the cold that seemed to penetrate its very bones. The contrast between the strength of the castle's stone walls and the vulnerability they revealed during the winter months speaks to the paradox of medieval life. Despite their formidable exterior, these castles were, in the end, subject to the whims of nature. It is in this vulnerability that the true story of winter survival begins, through the ingenuity and resilience of those who worked in the kitchens and hearths to keep the castle alive, despite the cold. In a medieval castle, amidst its towering stone walls, its sweeping courtyards, and its high battlements, there was one place that stood at the center of life and survival: the kitchen. It was not merely a room for the preparation of food but a vital, bustling space that provided warmth, sustenance, and the very lifeblood needed to endure the brutal cold of winter. The kitchen was the beating heart of the castle, and its significance far exceeded the simple act of feeding those within its walls. In the harsh winter months, the kitchen became even more crucial, as it transformed from a space of daily sustenance into a sanctuary of survival. While the rest of the castle seemed cold, dark, and inhospitable, the kitchen was a place of constant movement. The heat of the fires, the smells of roasting meats and simmering stews, and the clatter of pots and utensils created a stark contrast to the rest of the fortress. The kitchen was alive with activity, and it was in this space where the work of survival took place. This wasn't just a room for the cooks and servants. It was a room where the fate of the castle's inhabitants was decided. It was the room where the fire would burn throughout the long, dark winter nights, and where the food necessary to sustain everyone would be prepared and distributed. To understand the importance of the medieval kitchen, it is essential to first appreciate its design and layout. Medieval kitchens were typically large and located near the outer walls of the castle, separate from the main living quarters. This arrangement was partly due to the constant danger of fire, as kitchens, with their large hearths and open flames, posed a significant risk to the castle's wooden structures. The separate location also allowed for easier ventilation of the smoke that would inevitably billow from the fires used for cooking. The kitchen's location, however, also meant that it had to be an especially hard-working space. It had to be fully stocked with food supplies and carefully designed to maximize its capacity for food preservation and preparation. At the heart of the kitchen was the hearth, large, open, and often located against the wall. The hearth was not only used for cooking but also for heating the space. In medieval kitchens, the fire would burn constantly throughout the day, providing heat to the cooks and staff working in the room. The hearth itself would be large enough to roast whole animals, boil vast pots of stew, and bake bread. The immense heat it generated helped to keep the kitchen warm, and its light illuminated the otherwise dark stone room. For the workers in the kitchen, the hearth was their focal point, and its fire was their constant companion. The kitchen was a chaotic yet organized space, constantly in motion. Cooks and servants scurried about, preparing meals, tending to the fire, and ensuring that every task was completed with precision. The kitchen staff were a tight-knit group, accustomed to the demands of castle life. They worked tirelessly, day and night, to ensure that there was always enough food to feed the castle's inhabitants. As winter set in, this task became even more critical. With the outside world cut off by snow and ice, the kitchen had to rely on preserved foods from autumn harvests, salted meats, dried fruits, grains, and vegetables, along with what little fresh food could be brought in. Every morsel of food had to be carefully managed, rationed, and used to its fullest potential. Wasting food was unthinkable. In addition to food preparation, the kitchen was also the hub for food storage. This was no simple task, especially during winter, when food supplies had to last for months. The kitchen would contain vast stores of salted meats and fish, barrels of grain, dried herbs, vegetables, and fruits, anything that could be preserved. The preservation techniques employed in the medieval kitchen were both ingenious and essential. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying were the most common methods used to ensure that food would last throughout the long winter months. These techniques, passed down through generations, were crucial for survival. Without them, the castle would be at the mercy of the harsh winter, unable to provide food for its inhabitants. The kitchen also housed the wine cellars and ale storage, another vital part of castle life. Wine, ale, and mead were essential for keeping the people of the castle hydrated and nourished, especially in a time when water sources were often contaminated or unsafe to drink. The wine cellar, though not always attached directly to the kitchen, was an integral part of the castle's food storage. Casks of wine and ale would be kept in cool, dark places to preserve them, and the kitchen would manage their distribution as needed. The presence of these beverages also made the kitchen a place of festivity, especially during the cold winter months when the hearth was a place of gathering and warmth. But beyond the physical labor of cooking and food preservation, the kitchen played a psychological and emotional role in the castle's daily life. In the midst of the castle's cold stone walls and the gloom of winter, the kitchen was a place of comfort. The smells of roasting meats, fresh-baked bread, and stews filled the air, creating a sense of warmth and security. The kitchen staff, often overlooked in the grand schemes of nobility, were the ones who brought comfort to the cold, who provided the warmth of the hearth and the sustenance that kept the castle alive. It was in the kitchen that the harsh reality of medieval life was balanced by moments of care and kindness, as workers shared a meal and a moment of respite by the fire. The kitchen was also a social space, albeit one largely for the working class of the castle. The lords and ladies rarely ventured into the kitchen, leaving it to the cooks, scullions, and other servants. Yet, it was within the walls of the kitchen that many of the castle's social interactions took place. Meals were prepared for the household, often shared by the workers themselves. These workers, often from the local peasantry, formed a tight community within the castle. They would spend their days together, working long hours in the heat of the kitchen, but also sharing moments of camaraderie and solidarity. In a way, the kitchen was the true heart of the castle, not in its grand halls but in the intimate moments shared by the workers who kept it running. While the castle's great hall might have been the stage for feasts and celebrations, it was the kitchen that made these events possible. The kitchen was the place where large quantities of food were prepared for banquets and feasts, where the intricate dishes of the nobility were created by skilled cooks who had mastered their craft over years of training. The size and scale of medieval feasts were astonishing, and the kitchen had to be equipped to handle these immense demands. The preparation for a feast would involve hours of work, with meats roasting, breads baking, and sauces simmering. It was a Herculean task, often requiring the coordination of many workers to ensure that everything came together at the right time. When the lords and ladies of the castle sat down to dine, they would often be unaware of the incredible effort that had gone into their meal. Despite the grandeur of these feasts, the kitchen's everyday function was far less glamorous. The kitchen was a place of labor, sweat, and tireless work. The workers who spent their days there, stirring pots, baking bread, and roasting meats, were often the lowest in the castle's social hierarchy. Yet without their hard work, the castle would not have survived the winter months. It was they who ensured that the food was plentiful, the fire was stoked, and the castle remained a warm refuge from the bitter cold outside. The kitchen, in essence, was where life in the castle began and ended. Without it, the castle would have been little more than a cold, lifeless fortress. It was the kitchen that provided the warmth, sustenance, and community needed to survive the harshest of winters. In the heart of every medieval castle, especially during the grueling winter months, there was one element that held absolute power: fire. Without it, the castle's very existence would have been threatened, especially as the winter chill began to take its hold. Fire was not just a source of light or warmth in the cold, stone halls. It was the lifeline of the entire castle. It was through fire that the castle's residents could cook, preserve food, heat water, and protect themselves from the biting cold. In a world without modern heating or electricity, fire was the only means of survival during the harshest seasons, and its significance in a medieval castle cannot be overstated. When winter descended upon the castle, the warmth provided by fire became a matter of life and death. The stone walls that made up the castle's towering structure were ideal for defense but dreadful when it came to maintaining warmth. Stone is a poor insulator, and without the fire's heat, the castle's rooms and corridors could easily turn into ice-cold chambers. Even the grand halls, often the focal point of the castle's social life, could become uncomfortable, their immense spaces too large for a single hearth to warm effectively. Yet, with fire, these spaces could be transformed into places of comfort and community, where warmth radiated through the air, providing not only physical heat but also a sense of security. The fire in the hearth was the castle's most cherished commodity during winter. It was the source of heat for the kitchen, the great hall, the private chambers, and any room that could benefit from warmth. The hearth itself was often a large, open structure built into the wall, its flames licking the stone above, filling the air with the smell of burning wood and roasting meats. These hearths were the centerpiece of the kitchen and the living quarters, serving as a symbol of both survival and domestic life. The cooks and servants would gather around the fire, tending it throughout the day, ensuring that the flames never flickered out, especially on those bitterly cold nights when the outside world seemed so far removed from the warmth of the castle. In the kitchen, the hearth had a dual purpose. It was the place where food was prepared, but it also served as the primary source of heat. The massive fire allowed the cooks to roast meats, boil stews, bake bread, and even heat water for washing. The entire functioning of the kitchen was built around the fire. It was not just a tool, but the foundation of the kitchen's operations. For cooks, the fire was a living, breathing entity. It required constant attention, stoking, and replenishing with fresh fuel. If the fire died out, the kitchen would become cold and useless. During the winter months, firewood was a crucial resource, and each log of wood was carefully chosen and placed into the hearth. The effort to keep the fire burning was tireless, but the alternative was far worse: a cold, dark kitchen that could not provide the meals necessary to sustain the castle's inhabitants. Outside the kitchen, fire had another critical role to play. In the private chambers of the lord and lady, the hearth would provide the only source of warmth in their personal quarters. Even in the more luxurious rooms, with tapestries and heavy drapes to block the cold, the fire was essential. The lord and lady's personal servants would keep the hearth burning throughout the night, ensuring that their rooms were warm enough to sleep in. However, like the kitchen, the fire's warmth could only reach so far. In the farthest corners of the castle, in the servant quarters or in the coldest towers, the fire often had little reach. The isolation of these rooms during the winter months made them unbearably cold, and the inhabitants had to bundle themselves in layers of wool and fur to survive. Fire also played a key role in the preservation of food. In medieval times, the concept of refrigeration didn't exist, so food preservation had to rely on methods such as salting, smoking, and drying. But the heat of fire was still necessary for many of these preservation techniques. Meat was often smoked over a fire to both cook and preserve it, and fish was salted and dried with the aid of fire. The fire also allowed the kitchen staff to boil water, which was essential for cleaning, brewing ale, and even sanitizing the tools used for food preparation. In a castle where hygiene standards were rudimentary, fire acted as a critical purifier, making it a key ally in the prevention of disease. But fire in the castle wasn't just about warmth and food, it was also about safety. During the long winter nights, when the cold seemed to seep into every corner of the fortress, the fire became a symbol of security. The flickering flames of the hearth offered not only warmth but also the comfort of light in an otherwise dark and isolated world. The castle's great halls, where members of the household might gather to share meals or stories, were made bearable by the light and heat of the fire. In those moments, the fire was more than just a physical necessity. It was a beacon of normalcy in an otherwise harsh environment. It provided a sense of hope and connection during the brutal months when the outside world was shut off by snow and ice. Outside the safety of the castle, fire also served a vital function in the defense of the castle itself. In the event of a siege, the ability to maintain fire was critical not only for cooking and heating but also for signaling. In times of conflict, the fires of the castle could be used to communicate with nearby settlements or with other castles in the region. Smoke from the fires could send signals to allies, warning of an impending attack or calling for reinforcements. The fires also served as a visual deterrent, signaling to any would-be invaders that the castle's inhabitants were prepared to defend their home at all costs. But fire was also a force of destruction, and the threat of a fire getting out of control was ever present. Castles, with their wooden roofs and floors, were particularly vulnerable to fire. A single spark from the hearth could spread rapidly, engulfing entire rooms in flames. This danger was a constant fear for the castle's inhabitants. Fire was both a life-sustaining force and a potential destroyer. The kitchen, with its open flames, was particularly at risk, and many castles had strict rules in place to minimize the danger of accidental fires. Guards and servants were tasked with ensuring that the hearths were properly managed and that the firewood was stored safely. Still, accidents could and did happen. In a world where fire was both necessary and dangerous, managing its presence in the castle was a delicate balance. The role of fire in a medieval castle was far-reaching. It was not just a simple tool but the very foundation of life within the castle walls. From heating the castle to cooking meals, preserving food, purifying water, and even defending the castle, fire was an omnipresent force. The hearths in the kitchen, the lord's chambers, and the great hall were the heart of the castle, without which survival in the brutal winter months would have been impossible. In the end, fire was more than just an element. It was the lifeline of the castle, the force that allowed the inhabitants to endure the cold and thrive in a world that otherwise would have seemed unforgiving and bleak. Without fire, a castle could not survive winter. Without fire, the medieval world would have been a much colder, darker place. In the isolated, cold, and often brutal world of medieval castles, one of the most important skills that determined survival through the long winter months was food preservation. Castles, surrounded by cold, barren landscapes and cut off from the outside world by snow and ice, had to be self-sufficient, especially when it came to food. The ability to store and preserve food effectively was not just a convenience, it was a matter of life and death. The harsh winters, with their extended periods of snow and freezing temperatures, meant that food would not always be available fresh. Therefore, preserving food for the months to come became a critical and complex task. It was a matter of ensuring the castle's residents could survive long periods of isolation while still receiving the nutrition and sustenance necessary to remain healthy and strong. At the heart of medieval food preservation was the idea of extending the life of food in order to avoid the desperate circumstances of famine. The methods used for food preservation in a medieval castle were rooted in practicality and ingenuity, relying on natural elements like salt, smoke, air, and the cold itself. Without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, these ancient methods were the key to survival. The castle's kitchen, the heart of food production, became a hive of activity as food had to be carefully processed, stored, and monitored for the months when fresh supplies would be impossible to obtain. One of the oldest and most reliable methods of preservation was salting. Salt, a precious and expensive commodity in the medieval world, was used to preserve a wide range of foods, especially meats and fish. Salted meats, beef, pork, mutton, and especially fish, were stored in barrels or hung in cool, dry places where they could last through the cold winter months. Salt drew the moisture out of the meat, which helped to inhibit the growth of bacteria and other spoilage-causing agents. This preservation method was so effective that salted meats were staples in the diet of those living in castles, often forming the bulk of their meals. The process of salting was labor-intensive, but it was a necessary ritual for the kitchen staff, especially as winter approached. Each piece of meat had to be carefully rubbed with salt and packed tightly into barrels to ensure its longevity. This was not only the responsibility of the kitchen staff but also of the people working on the castle's grounds, who would hunt and prepare the animals. Smoking, another technique employed in the preservation of food, was also crucial to survival in the medieval world. Meat, fish, and even cheese could be smoked to add flavor and ensure preservation. The smoke, generated by a slow-burning fire in a smokehouse, helped to dry out the food and imparted a distinctive flavor that became highly valued. Smoking was often used in conjunction with salting, as the two methods worked together to create food that could survive for months without spoiling. The process of smoking meat was a slow and meticulous one, requiring careful attention to the fire and the placement of the food. The smoked meats were then hung in cool, dry places, often in specially designated rooms in the castle, where they could be stored until they were needed. Drying was another method of preservation that was essential in medieval castles. Many fruits and vegetables, once harvested, were dried to preserve them for the winter months. Apples, pears, plums, and berries were commonly dried, either by hanging them in the kitchen or by placing them in the warmth of the hearth. This method helped to remove excess moisture, preventing spoilage while concentrating the flavors. Dried vegetables, such as peas, beans, and onions, were also commonly stored in this way. These dried foods formed the basis of many medieval stews, soups, and broths, offering sustenance when fresh ingredients were unavailable. The dried fruits and vegetables would be soaked in water before being added to meals, rehydrating them and making them a crucial source of nutrition during the long, cold months. Root vegetables, such as carrots, turnips, and parsnips, were also commonly preserved by storing them in cool, dark places, where the cold would naturally slow down their decay. These vegetables could be placed in cellars or pits dug into the ground, where the temperature remained relatively constant, even during the worst of the winter. While not as long-lasting as smoked or salted meats, root vegetables provided much-needed nutrition and were often the only form of fresh food that remained available when the weather turned harsh. In addition to these methods, medieval kitchens would also employ pickling and fermenting to preserve vegetables and fruits. Pickling involved submerging vegetables, such as cucumbers, onions, or cabbage, in brine or vinegar. The acid in the brine helped to preserve the food, creating a tangy, sour flavor that became an integral part of the medieval diet. Fermentation, on the other hand, was used to preserve foods like cabbage, which could be turned into sauerkraut, or grains, which could be used to make ale or other fermented drinks. Fermented foods were important not just for preservation but also for their role in nutrition. They helped to provide essential vitamins and were often more easily digestible than fresh foods, especially in the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. The preservation of dairy was another critical task in the medieval kitchen. Cheese, in particular, was a staple of the medieval diet and could be kept for months, if not longer. Different varieties of cheese were made from milk, often from cows, sheep, or goats. Some cheeses were smoked, while others were salted or simply allowed to age. The aging process allowed cheese to develop rich, complex flavors, and it was a vital source of protein and fat during the cold months. Milk itself was often turned into butter, which could also be preserved, sometimes by salting or by storing it in cool, dark places. Butter, however, had a shorter shelf life and was typically consumed more quickly. The preservation of grain and flour was equally important, especially in castles where bread and porridge were central to the diet. Grains such as barley, oats, and rye were harvested in the summer and stored in granaries or silos, often located within the castle walls to protect them from theft or bad weather. Grain, when stored properly, could last for months. In times of famine or siege, grain stored in the castle would be one of the most valuable resources, offering a means of sustenance for the castle's residents. The flour milled from the grain was used to bake bread and prepare porridges, which formed the foundation of many meals. For all of the complexities involved in food preservation, it was ultimately the combination of these techniques: salting, smoking, drying, pickling, fermenting, and careful storage that allowed a medieval castle to endure through the harshest winters. The skillful management of the castle's stores of food, the careful preservation of resources, and the reliance on these methods to maintain a steady food supply allowed the castle's inhabitants to survive in a world where winters could stretch endlessly and food supplies could dwindle to dangerous levels. Food preservation in a medieval castle was an art form and a science. It required a deep knowledge of the food itself, of the ways in which each type of food could be best preserved, and of the conditions needed to ensure that the stored food would last. It was a constant balancing act. Too little food and the castle's residents would starve, too much, and the food could spoil or become infested with pests. The kitchens, with their intricate systems of storage and preservation, were the true foundation of winter survival. Without the ability to preserve food, the castle's inhabitants would have found themselves utterly dependent on the unpredictable whims of nature. In a world where famine was always a lurking danger, food preservation became the silent hero of winter, ensuring that the castle's gates remained open, its fires burning, and its people fed. The survival of a medieval castle during the cold, harsh winter months was not solely reliant on the strength of its walls or the resilience of its food preservation methods. The true heart of a castle's ability to endure the relentless chill was the tireless, often unnoticed work of the people who kept the castle alive. While the lord and lady of the castle and their guests enjoyed the luxuries of warmth, grand feasts, and lavish social events, it was the servants, soldiers, cooks, and other lower-ranking individuals who carried the burden of maintaining the castle's daily functions during winter. These men and women were the silent workers whose labor ensured that the castle's great hearths stayed alive, the food stores were replenished, and the fortification held strong against the biting cold outside. They were the unsung heroes of medieval castle life, working long hours in challenging conditions to ensure the safety, comfort, and survival of the castle's inhabitants. Among the most crucial workers in the castle were the kitchen staff. These individuals were responsible for preparing the meals that would sustain everyone within the castle walls. As winter approached, the kitchen became a frenetic space where food had to be carefully managed and rationed. The kitchen staff, which might include cooks, scullions, and kitchen assistants, worked tirelessly to prepare large quantities of food from the preserved stores that had been gathered over the warmer months. The cooks, skilled in the art of making the most out of salted meats, dried fruits, and vegetables, were indispensable to the castle's survival. They were responsible for roasting, boiling, and baking, turning the meager winter supplies into warm, nourishing meals that could sustain the castle's residents through the long months of isolation. The role of the kitchen staff was not limited to food preparation alone. They were also charged with maintaining the fire in the hearth. The hearth, the center of the kitchen's activities, had to be constantly tended to, ensuring that the fire didn't go out, particularly during the bitterly cold nights when the outside temperature dropped drastically. Gathering and chopping firewood, keeping it stocked, and stoking the flames were all part of the daily duties of the kitchen staff. Without them, the kitchen would have grown cold, and the food preparation and preservation process would have been compromised. The kitchen staff's ability to work through the night, often with little rest, was a critical factor in the castle's ability to survive the winter months. Equally important were the men and women who worked to keep the castle warm and safe: servants, soldiers, and guards. The castle's many rooms, chambers, and towers needed to be regularly tended to, especially when the outside temperature plummeted. In addition to stoking the fires, guards and servants would have been responsible for ensuring that no drafts entered the castle through cracks in the walls, doors, or windows. They would inspect the castle structure for any damage caused by the cold or the weather, repairing cracks in the stonework or replacing broken windows to ensure that the elements did not seep in. The stone walls of the castle, while strong against siege weapons, did little to prevent the intrusion of winter's chill. Thus, soldiers and guards, often placed at strategic points around the castle, would help to secure the fortress's warmth and prevent the cold from infiltrating the rooms of the castle's residents. Soldiers in particular had a unique and demanding role during the winter months. While their primary duty was to defend the castle, in the winter, they were also tasked with ensuring that the castle remained operational. Soldiers who were not stationed on watch or in the courtyard might be found assisting the kitchen staff, gathering firewood, or helping to maintain the heating systems. They also assisted in the crucial task of ensuring the castle was stocked with enough provisions to survive until spring. During this time, soldiers might be sent out on scouting missions to check on food supplies, assist with hunting, or retrieve any supplies that were still available from nearby villages. Their role in the castle's survival was not just one of defense but of resource management and upkeep, ensuring that the castle remained a safe and habitable place through the winter months. However, it wasn't just the castle staff and soldiers who contributed to the survival of the fortress during winter. The work of the castle's stewards, housekeepers, and other administrators was also indispensable. These individuals were responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the castle and ensuring that all the systems, food, warmth, and security ran smoothly. The steward, often one of the most trusted individuals in the castle, would have coordinated the activities of the various staff, ensuring that the food was prepared, the fires were stoked, and the storage areas were organized. They kept track of the supplies, ensuring that nothing went to waste and that each person received their fair share of food, firewood, and other essentials. The housekeepers, too, played a critical role in keeping the castle functioning, particularly during the winter months. They would have maintained the cleanliness of the castle, ensuring that the many rooms and chambers, even those that were used by the lower-ranking members of the castle, remained habitable. The housekeepers would also have been responsible for distributing blankets, warm clothing, and other essential items to ensure the comfort of those living in the colder areas of the castle. In addition to the practical work of maintaining warmth, food, and safety, the people who worked in the castle also had to navigate the psychological toll of winter. The long, cold months of isolation could be grueling, and the relentless darkness and chill took a toll on the morale of the castle's inhabitants. The kitchen staff, soldiers, and servants spent long hours working together in close quarters, often without much time for rest or recreation. For many, the work was grueling, and the monotony of the long winter months could feel endless. Yet, it was in these moments that the strength of community within the castle became most apparent. The shared experience of struggling through the winter together helped to build camaraderie and trust. The kitchen staff and soldiers, working side by side, found solace in the warmth of the hearth and the shared task of keeping the castle running. The winter also posed challenges of social hierarchy. While the lord and lady of the castle and their guests enjoyed the warmth and luxury of their private chambers, they were isolated from the reality of life in the castle during winter. The lower-ranking members of the household bore the brunt of the labor, and it was their work that allowed the castle's social hierarchy to function. The cooks, servants, and soldiers worked in the background, often unnoticed by those above them, yet their labor was essential to the survival of the entire castle. These workers did not have the comforts of a warm bed or a lavish feast. They faced the cold, the darkness, and the physical exhaustion of their tasks, yet they persevered, knowing that their work ensured the survival of those they served. The role of the people who kept the castle alive extended beyond the physical tasks they performed. It was their resilience, their dedication, and their willingness to work tirelessly for the survival of the castle that truly made the difference. They faced immense challenges, including long hours, harsh weather, and the ever-present threat of disease or starvation. Yet, through their efforts, they ensured that the castle's fires remained lit, its food stores were well maintained, and its defenses were secure. The workers who lived and worked in the castle were not just laborers. They were the backbone of the castle's survival, providing the warmth, sustenance, and protection that allowed the castle's inhabitants to weather the darkest months of the year. In the end, the survival of a medieval castle during the cold, brutal winters was not just a matter of resource management or architectural design. It was about the people who lived within its walls. Without their hard work, their dedication, and their ability to adapt to the harsh realities of medieval life, the castle would not have survived. It was the people, often unseen and unheard, who kept the castle alive, ensuring that it remained a place of warmth, safety, and sustenance in the coldest of seasons. Winter brought with it not only the relentless cold but also the threat of siege. Castles, despite their impressive fortifications and strategic positions, were vulnerable to the harsh reality of medieval warfare. While sieges could occur at any time of the year, winter posed an even more dangerous and harrowing challenge for both defenders and attackers. The combination of freezing temperatures, snow, and the isolation caused by blocked roads and rivers created a perfect storm for a prolonged siege. During these grim months, the castle's ability to withstand not just the attacks of the enemy, but the adversities of winter, would be tested in ways that could push the limits of human endurance. A castle's most significant defense against a siege was its strong walls, towers, and gatehouses, its impenetrable fortifications. However, the physical strength of the walls alone was not enough to ensure survival. When winter descended upon a besieged castle, the situation became far more dire. While defenders might be able to hold out for weeks or months, the battle against the elements became a challenge of its own. Food stores, which were already dwindling due to the inability to bring in fresh supplies, would run low more quickly when the roads were impassable. Fresh water sources, often a crucial part of the castle's daily life, could freeze, leaving the defenders without a lifeline. In these moments, the very structure of the castle, its walls, its kitchens, its stores, would come under intense pressure. A siege during the winter months meant that any external support, whether from local villages or allies, was far more difficult to obtain. Roads could be blocked by snow or made treacherous by ice, making it almost impossible to bring in new supplies or reinforcements. Even if the besieging forces were not actively fighting, the castle's defenders were still in peril, trapped in a frigid fortress with dwindling resources. Food, which had already been preserved and stored in anticipation of winter, would soon be rationed to the point of exhaustion. Salted meats, dried vegetables, and stored grains would be consumed, and the limited supply of fresh water would diminish. If the attackers had already cut off the food supply or destroyed any nearby farmland, the defenders would be forced to make do with whatever scraps they could salvage. The mental and physical toll of a winter siege was incalculable. For the soldiers and defenders, whose primary task was to fight off the besieging army, the winter months brought added hardships. Cold weather could freeze weapons and armor, making them harder to wield in battle. The cold could cause frostbite, exhaustion, and hypothermia, weakening the defenders' ability to stand guard or fight off an assault. The heavy, wet snow that accumulated around the castle would make the work of maintaining the fortifications more difficult. The trenches and ditches that surrounded the castle, often used to protect against attackers or prevent tunneling, would become filled with snow and ice, making them less effective. And even in the relative safety of the castle's walls, life was unbearable. The cold would creep into every corner, turning the great halls, the barracks, and even the keep into ice-cold spaces that offered little comfort. Those inside the castle, facing the dangers of both the enemy and the elements, would need not only physical strength but mental resilience to survive. As the siege stretched on, the defenders would have to rely on their stored supplies. For many, this meant the preservation methods of salt, smoke, and drying that had kept the castle's inhabitants alive during the winter months would now be tested to their limits. Salted meats and dried fruits would sustain the defenders, but the quantity would be limited, and with each passing day, the meals would grow more meager. Dried vegetables and grains might be turned into porridge or stew, but the monotony of the food could demoralize the soldiers, especially if the siege lasted weeks or even months. The lack of fresh food and the isolation from the outside world would take a toll on morale. Disease could spread more easily in the confined, cold spaces of the castle, with illnesses like scurvy becoming more common due to the lack of fresh produce and the stress of the prolonged siege. The castle's kitchens, which had once been places of warmth, activity, and a hub of daily life, would transform during a siege into a nerve center of survival. The kitchen staff, already burdened by the work of feeding the castle's inhabitants, would now have to stretch every portion of food to last for as long as possible. The cooks would have to carefully manage the dwindling supplies, rationing out the meals and constantly calculating how much longer the stores would last. The fire in the hearth, which had once been used for cooking and warmth, would now serve as the last line of defense against the cold and starvation. It would burn constantly, not just to cook, but to keep the defenders warm, even if it meant using the last of the firewood. For the attackers, winter was not a respite. It was a brutal challenge that made their task of starving out the defenders more difficult. While a siege could often involve cutting off the castle's supply lines, winter made it much harder to maintain the blockade. Snow and ice would hinder the attackers' ability to move freely, especially if they relied on supply caravans or soldiers bringing in food and materials. Frozen rivers and impassable roads could stall the progress of the besieging army, preventing them from maintaining a consistent pressure on the castle. The attackers' own supply lines would also be vulnerable to the harsh winter weather, potentially leading to shortages of their own. Still, the attackers had an advantage that the defenders did not: the ability to retreat and seek shelter. For the soldiers surrounding the castle, winter meant little more than discomfort, whereas for the defenders inside, it meant being trapped, exposed to both the enemy's attacks and the unrelenting cold. The defenders could not escape the siege, and while they might seek shelter in the cold stone walls of the keep, the cold would still penetrate every crevice, making their existence unbearable. As the siege wore on, both sides would be drawn into a battle of endurance. Who could last longer, the besieged or the besiegers? Both sides had to withstand the psychological pressure of the isolation, the constant threat of hunger, and the deepening cold. For those trapped inside the castle, the promise of eventual rescue or relief from the siege became a lifeline, a thread of hope that sustained them. For the attackers, the pressure was on to break the siege before their own resources ran out, while also attempting to find ways to starve the defenders into submission. In these dire conditions, the people of the castle would find that survival was not only a matter of military tactics or the strength of the castle's walls, it was about endurance, resourcefulness, and hope. As the defenders fought off the cold, hunger, and the enemy, they clung to the belief that spring would eventually come, that the roads would clear, and that reinforcements would arrive. But winter sieges often had the power to break even the most resilient of castles. The combination of external threats, starvation, disease, and the relentless cold, and internal struggles, dwindling resources, fragile morale, and the overwhelming isolation, would test even the most fortified stronghold. Castles that endured the siege often did so by a sheer act of will, their inhabitants fighting for survival, holding on to the belief that the cold, the hunger, and the enemy would eventually be driven away. Ultimately, a winter siege was a test of not just physical strength, but of the spirit. It was the kind of trial that could break even the strongest fortifications, and in some cases, the defenders themselves. The relentless cold, the looming hunger, and the continuous threat of the enemy meant that everyone inside the castle had to push themselves to the limits of endurance, relying on each other, their ingenuity, and their ability to adapt to the crushing weight of winter's twin threats, nature and man. In the end, it was not just the resilience of the stone walls that kept the castle standing, but the tenacity of the people within who, against all odds, continued to fight, to survive, and to hold on through the darkest, coldest months of the year. The harsh winter months brought more than just physical hardships to those who lived in medieval castles. The cold, isolation, and scarcity of resources imposed a deep psychological toll on both the defenders and the residents within the fortress. The experience of winter in a medieval castle was one of intense endurance, not just of the body, but of the mind. As the outside world became a barren landscape of snow and ice, the people inside the castle faced not only the brutal cold and the looming threat of starvation or siege but the mental and emotional strain of prolonged confinement. The psychological challenges of surviving winter in a medieval fortress were profound, with isolation, monotony, and fear slowly eroding the spirits of those trapped within. For those living within the castle, the winter months often meant an extended period of isolation from the outside world. The roads and paths would be blocked by snow and ice, and the harsh weather made it almost impossible for any travel to or from the castle. The isolation during the winter months was not merely physical, it was a deep psychological experience that could wear down even the strongest minds. The residents of the castle, cut off from the normal rhythms of life and the comforts of the outside world, faced a winter of stifled communication, frayed nerves, and deepening solitude. While the lord and lady of the castle might still enjoy occasional visits from local dignitaries or travelers, for the vast majority of the castle's inhabitants, servants, soldiers, and cooks, their world became an increasingly narrow one, confined to the stone walls and darkened halls of the fortress. For these individuals, the lack of outside contact contributed to feelings of disconnection and helplessness. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the only sounds were the howling winds outside and the constant crackle of the hearth within. This isolation fostered a sense of claustrophobia. In the castles of the medieval period, space was at a premium, and the cold only magnified this sense of confinement. The rooms within the castle were often large and echoing, but the coldness of the stone walls could make them feel even more oppressive. The fires in the hearths provided heat and light but also confined people to specific areas of the castle, typically near the fire, while the far reaches of the fortress became inhospitable. Servants and soldiers who were assigned to guard duty or patrols during the winter months would find themselves stuck in frigid, isolated sections of the castle, while the great hall and private chambers remained warmer and more comfortable. The vastness of the castle, while a strength in defense, could also contribute to feelings of loneliness and separation, with individuals often feeling more like prisoners within the fortress rather than its residents. Monotony played a major role in the psychological toll of the winter months. In a time before modern entertainment or communication, the passage of time in the castle during winter was often marked by repetitive, tiring tasks. For the castle servants, life could become a cycle of mundane duties: chopping firewood, stoking the hearth, preparing meals from the limited food stores, and cleaning the great halls. For the soldiers, it was a constant vigil, a never-ending routine of guard duty and surveillance of the cold, dark landscape outside. The lack of variety in daily life, especially in the absence of any distractions from the outside world, could lead to a deep sense of boredom and frustration. As the weeks turned into months, the monotony of survival became increasingly difficult to bear. The absence of fresh food, new supplies, or new faces made life seem like an endless loop of survival: eating, sleeping, working, and waiting for spring to arrive. The psychological toll of this repetitive existence, with no sense of progress or change, could lead to feelings of depression and hopelessness, especially for those who had little to do but wait out the winter. The fear of scarcity was another powerful psychological force during the winter months. The castle's inhabitants were always keenly aware of the limits of their food and firewood supplies. As the days grew colder and the resources grew scarcer, anxiety began to build. For the cooks and servants, there was a constant concern about whether the food stores would hold out. How long would the salted meats, dried fruits, and grains last? How much longer could the firewood be rationed? The fear of running out of food or fuel was a constant source of stress. For the soldiers, this fear was compounded by the reality of being trapped in a besieged castle. The psychological pressure of living under constant threat, whether from an external siege or the internal anxiety of dwindling resources, could cause intense mental strain. In times of crisis, when food or firewood became even more limited, the castle's residents might turn on each other in desperate bids for survival. The stress of managing supplies, combined with the isolation and monotony, could erode the cohesion of the castle's community, leading to tension, arguments, and even violence among those living under the same roof. But perhaps the greatest psychological challenge during the winter months was the unrelenting fear of attack. During a siege, the defenders of the castle had to deal not only with the cold and hunger but also with the constant threat of death or injury. The cold, icy nights were filled with the tension of knowing that at any moment, the enemy might launch a surprise assault. Soldiers were stationed at the walls, eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape for any signs of movement, while the rest of the castle's inhabitants awaited the worst. The mental toll of living under siege was profound. The defenders had to maintain vigilance, not only against the enemy but also against their own fears and doubts. The nights, long and cold, were filled with anxious thoughts. Would the enemy break through? Would reinforcements arrive in time? The psychological burden of uncertainty weighed heavily on the defenders, many of whom had little to do except wait and worry. In addition to these constant fears, there was the ever-present threat of illness and disease. The crowded, cold conditions within the castle could provide the perfect breeding ground for sickness. The psychological toll of knowing that an outbreak of plague or fever could strike at any moment added an additional layer of stress to an already difficult situation. The isolation of winter meant that there was little relief from the grinding fear of illness. With limited medical knowledge and resources, a simple cold or infection could turn deadly. As diseases spread, so too did fear and paranoia. The psychological effect of living under such constant stress could cause individuals to become irritable, frightened, and detached. For many, the fear of disease or injury was as great a threat as the cold or hunger itself. Amidst all of this, there was also a constant undercurrent of hope, the hope that winter would eventually end, that reinforcements would arrive, and that spring would bring relief. The change of season was a powerful symbol of renewal, both physically and psychologically. The promise of warmer days, of a return to normalcy, helped to sustain the residents of the castle even in the darkest moments. The arrival of a messenger, the sighting of a distant ally, or even the mere clearing of the roads in spring could provide the psychological boost needed to endure the final stretch of winter. But as much as this hope was vital, it was also fragile. Many, particularly those in positions of power, might not have shared their own fear and anxiety with those beneath them. The lord and lady, while somewhat shielded from the worst of the conditions, could also feel the crushing weight of responsibility for the safety and survival of everyone within the castle. In the end, the psychological toll of winter in a medieval castle was profound and pervasive. It affected every aspect of life, from the way people worked to the way they interacted with each other. The isolation, monotony, fear, and uncertainty created a mental landscape that was as challenging to navigate as the physical hardships of the season. The castle's inhabitants, especially those in positions of authority, had to maintain a delicate balance between hope and despair, between endurance and collapse. It was this mental fortitude, as much as the strength of the castle's walls or the quality of its food stores, that allowed them to survive the harshest of winters. In the midst of the harsh winter, when the world outside the castle walls was a frozen expanse of snow and ice, the heart of castle life remained within the warmth of the Great Hall. This central space, far more than just a dining area, served as the soul of the castle, a place where both the social and functional aspects of medieval life came together. During the long winter months, the Great Hall became a place of refuge, where both the nobility and the castle's servants found shelter from the cold and isolation. It was a place for gatherings, feasts, and the exchange of news, but it was also the epicenter of work, survival, and human connection. The atmosphere in the hall was one of both warmth and tension, as the castle's inhabitants navigated the dual realities of comfort and adversity. The Great Hall was designed to accommodate the various social functions that occurred within the castle. It was where the lord and lady of the castle would entertain guests, hold court, and make decisions regarding the running of the estate. During the winter, it became an essential space for the administration of daily life. The fire at the heart of the hall blazed constantly, providing both heat and light during the darkest months of the year. In a time before artificial lighting, the hearth was a powerful symbol of warmth and life, the focal point around which people gathered. The great fireplaces in the hall would burn throughout the day and night, ensuring that the interior of the castle remained bearable even as the cold winds howled outside. The crackling of the fire provided a comforting sound amidst the silence of the snow-covered landscape. For the nobility, the warmth of the great hall offered a respite from the frigid conditions of the castle's stone chambers, where the cold could penetrate even the thickest tapestries and fur rugs. However, the Great Hall was not just a sanctuary for the upper echelons of the castle's society. During the winter, it became a communal space for everyone in the castle. The castle staff, soldiers, servants, and workers would all spend a significant amount of time in the hall, gathering around the fire for warmth, to take meals, or simply to share moments of respite. For the lord and lady, the presence of their servants and retainers in the hall was both a reminder of their responsibilities and a source of companionship during the long, lonely months. The lower-ranking members of the household, particularly the kitchen staff, would spend much of their time in or near the Great Hall, preparing meals for the household and ensuring that there was always enough food to last through the winter. The cooks and scullions worked tirelessly to prepare hearty stews, roasts, and breads that would nourish the castle's residents during the cold months. These meals, made from the preserved food stores, were often the only sources of warmth and comfort for the castle's inhabitants. The social life within the Great Hall during the winter months revolved around the communal aspects of life. It was a space where relationships were forged, alliances were solidified, and matters of governance were discussed. The lord and lady, despite the cold and isolation, would often host feasts or gatherings to entertain guests, whether they were fellow nobility, vassals, or traders who had managed to travel to the castle despite the snow. These feasts were not just about indulgence. They were about reinforcing social structures, demonstrating power, and maintaining the delicate web of political relationships that supported the castle's standing in the region. The grand tables in the Great Hall would be laden with food, often prepared from the castle's stores of salted meats, preserved vegetables, and grains. The meals were rich in flavor, albeit somewhat repetitive, made palatable by the spices and herbs that could be found in the castle's kitchens. There would be music, laughter, and storytelling, creating an atmosphere of warmth and camaraderie amid the cold and isolation. For the lower-ranking members of the household, life in the Great Hall during the winter was more utilitarian. It was a place to seek warmth and escape the cold, but it was also a space where work continued unabated. The servants would bustle about, fetching food, delivering drinks, and attending to the needs of the nobility. For the soldiers and guards, the Great Hall was a space to take a break from their duties on the walls and in the cold courtyard. While they were not always part of the social interactions in the hall, their presence reminded everyone that the castle was a place of protection, both from the cold and from external threats. The sense of security provided by the castle's walls was a shared experience for all who lived there, regardless of rank. The Great Hall was where people of different social classes, despite their divisions, found common ground. It was a place of collective experience, where warmth, food, and the shared rhythms of life brought people together, even if only temporarily, in the face of adversity. But while the Great Hall provided comfort, it was also a place where tensions could arise. The winter months, with their scarcity and isolation, could magnify existing conflicts. The Lord's authority was always in question, especially when resources began to dwindle or when the castle was threatened by external forces. The noble class would have to balance the needs of their household with the demands of their vassals and retainers, ensuring that the supplies were distributed fairly and that everyone remained loyal and content. Any perceived favoritism in the distribution of food or resources could spark unrest, and the Great Hall could quickly become a site of friction and anxiety. In a time when the disparity between the noble class and the lower classes was stark, the winter months only served to intensify these divisions. The lower-ranking members of the household, who worked tirelessly to keep the castle running, often faced the harshest conditions, yet their voices were rarely heard. Their existence was marked by long hours of work, limited comforts, and the ever-present tension of wondering whether there would be enough food to go around. The lord and lady, on the other hand, had to grapple with the weight of responsibility for everyone's welfare, managing both their personal comfort and the well-being of those they ruled over. This constant balancing act, played out in the confines of the Great Hall, added a layer of emotional complexity to the castle's winter life. During the winter months, the Great Hall also became a space for reflection and planning. With the arrival of winter came an inevitable slowing of outside activities, and the lord and lady of the castle would often use this time to review their estate, plan for the coming year, and engage in diplomatic correspondence with other castles or towns. The presence of a warm fire and the ability to conduct business in the comfort of the Great Hall made it an ideal setting for these kinds of discussions. While the snow and ice cut off the outside world, the castle's internal activities could continue, and the Great Hall remained a symbol of the ongoing function and power of the castle. The lord's ability to maintain authority during the winter months, while managing the social and practical needs of the castle, was a critical aspect of ensuring that the estate remained stable. The Great Hall was also a place where the castle's seasonal rhythms were marked, especially in times of religious observance. The winter months were often filled with feast days, holidays, and religious events that offered both respite from the harshness of life and a sense of community and tradition. Christmas, for instance, was a time for elaborate feasts and celebrations in the Great Hall. It was a time when people of all social classes could come together to celebrate the season, with large banquets, music, and revelry. The presence of religious figures, such as priests or monks, helped to reinforce the spiritual and moral framework of life in the castle. These religious observances, while often tied to the agricultural calendar, were also an opportunity for people to express gratitude for survival through the winter and to seek divine protection for the coming months. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, the Great Hall transformed from a place of mere function into a symbol of resilience. It was a space where the social fabric of the castle held strong despite the challenges of winter. Here, people gathered to share meals, to exchange news, to find comfort, and to remind each other that, despite the cold and isolation, they were not entirely alone. The Great Hall, with its roaring fires and bustling activity, became both a refuge and a reminder of the ever-present fragility of life during the medieval winter. For those who called the castle home, it was more than just a physical space. It was the emotional and social center of their survival through the most difficult months of the year. During the cold winter months, when the world outside the castle walls was covered in a blanket of snow and the fields lay dormant, hunting became a crucial activity for the survival of the fortress and its inhabitants. In medieval times, hunting was not just a pastime or a noble hobby, it was a vital means of obtaining food and ensuring that the castle's residents were properly nourished throughout the long winter. The winter hunts were often a test of skill, endurance, and resourcefulness. They required not only expert hunters but also the coordinated efforts of the castle's workforce, including soldiers, servants, and even the lord's family, all of whom understood the importance of the hunt for survival. The winter hunts often took place in the forests and woodlands surrounding the castle. These areas, while dangerous and unpredictable during the colder months, were home to a wide variety of game, from deer and wild boar to smaller creatures such as rabbits, hares, and birds. Hunting during winter, however, was far from easy. The frigid conditions made the pursuit of game more challenging. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures made tracking animals more difficult, and the hunters had to adapt their strategies accordingly. The cold also meant that the game itself was harder to find, as many animals would seek shelter in the deepest parts of the forest or hibernate during the coldest months. But the winter hunt was not only about the hunt itself, it was a social event, a display of skill, and a demonstration of the lord's ability to provide for his people. The lord of the castle, as the head of the household, was often directly involved in the hunt. For the nobility, hunting was a form of recreation, a way to display their prowess and to reaffirm their status as rulers of the land. The lord would lead the hunting party, accompanied by his most trusted hunters, knights, and sometimes even members of his family. The hunt provided an opportunity for the lord to assert his authority and leadership, as well as to bond with his retainers and guests. It was also a way for the lord to demonstrate his wealth and control over the surrounding land, as hunting rights were closely tied to landownership in medieval society. The lord's participation in the hunt ensured that he was seen as capable and strong, able to provide for his household and protect his people from the dangers of starvation or cold. For the hunters, the winter hunt was a test of skill and preparation. The hunters were often experienced individuals who knew the terrain well and understood the habits of the animals they pursued. They were adept at tracking, using signs like broken twigs, footprints, and the faint scent of animals to follow their quarry through the snow-covered landscape. They also had to be familiar with the hunting dogs, who played a crucial role in the chase. The dogs, often bred for their ability to track and catch game, were indispensable companions during the hunt. The bond between the hunters and their dogs was strong, as the dogs helped locate and flush out game, making the hunt more successful. The equipment used during the winter hunts was equally important. Longbows, crossbows, spears, and hunting knives were all essential tools that allowed the hunters to take down their prey. The longbows, in particular, were favored for their range and accuracy. Crossbows, while slower to reload, provided a powerful and deadly shot. The weapons used were often crafted specifically for the winter months, with modifications that took into account the challenges of hunting in cold, icy conditions. The hunters had to be prepared for all eventualities, from encountering aggressive game to navigating treacherous terrain. They needed to be physically fit and mentally sharp, capable of enduring the cold and the exhaustion that came with long hours in the field. While the lord and his hunters were the primary focus of the winter hunts, the entire castle community had a role to play in the process. Once the game was brought down, the work was far from over. The castle's cooks and servants were responsible for processing and preparing the meat, which would then be stored in the castle's larder for use throughout the winter. The butchers would skin, clean, and butcher the animals, dividing the meat into portions that could be easily preserved. The larger cuts of meat, such as venison or boar, would be salted or smoked to extend their shelf life, while smaller game like rabbits or birds might be eaten fresh or turned into stews. The preservation of game was critical, as the castle's supplies needed to last through the cold months until spring arrived and new sources of food could be gathered. The castle's women, particularly the lady of the house and her household staff, also played an essential role in preparing the game. They would prepare the meat for cooking, often making sausages, pies, or stews that could feed the castle's inhabitants. They also preserved the meat through drying, salting, or smoking, ensuring that there would be a steady supply of food even when the weather prevented the arrival of fresh provisions. The castle's larder, with its shelves of cured meats, dried fruits, and vegetables, became an essential lifeline during the winter, and the game from the winter hunts formed a critical part of that supply. While the focus of the winter hunts was primarily on securing food for the castle, there were also other benefits to these excursions. The hunt served as a social event, where relationships between the nobility and their retainers were strengthened. The lord's participation in the hunt was an opportunity for him to display his generosity, offering food and drink to his guests and rewarding his hunters with gifts or accolades for their skill. The camaraderie of the hunt helped to reinforce the bonds of loyalty between the lord and his followers, ensuring that the castle's internal hierarchy remained intact. The hunt was also a means of entertaining visiting guests, and the arrival of an esteemed visitor might be marked by a grand hunting expedition in their honor. The shared experience of the hunt, with its triumphs and challenges, allowed people of different ranks to interact in a more informal and personal way, deepening their relationships and reinforcing social bonds. In addition to the social benefits, the winter hunt was a symbol of the lord's power over the land. In the medieval period, hunting rights were closely tied to land ownership. The lord's ability to hunt on his land was a sign of his control over the territory and his right to exploit its resources. The winter hunt, with its difficulty and danger, was a reminder of the lord's mastery over nature itself. It was also a demonstration of the lord's role as protector of the land and its people. By bringing down game and securing food for the castle, the lord was fulfilling his duty to ensure the survival of his household. The hunt, in this sense, was both a physical act and a symbolic gesture, reaffirming the lord's authority and responsibility. While the winter hunts were essential for the survival of the castle, they were also dangerous. The harsh weather conditions, the risk of encountering aggressive game, and the physical strain of hunting in the snow and ice made the hunts perilous. Hunters had to be prepared for accidents, injuries, and the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. On rare occasions, a hunt could end in tragedy, with a hunter being injured or killed by a boar or falling from a height. The physical demands of the hunt also took a toll on the participants, with many hunters suffering from exhaustion, frostbite, or hypothermia after long hours in the cold. In the end, the winter hunt was an integral part of castle life during the cold months. It was about more than just the food that it provided. It was a symbol of survival, resilience, and the strength of the community. It was a reminder that, even in the harshest of winters, the castle's residents could rely on their skill, their cooperation, and their relationship with the land to endure. Through the winter hunts, they maintained not only their physical sustenance but also their social cohesion, reaffirming their bonds to each other and to the land they lived on. The winter hunts were a reminder of the interconnectedness of life in the medieval castle, where the survival of the community depended on the collective efforts of all who lived within its walls. The strategic importance of a medieval castle during the winter months cannot be overstated. The fortress was designed to serve as both a place of shelter and a formidable defense against the many threats that emerged during the colder seasons. Castles were often perched on elevated ground, surrounded by natural barriers like rivers, forests, or rocky outcroppings, which made them less vulnerable to attack. However, while these locations offered significant protection, they also posed unique challenges during the winter. The deepening cold, snow-covered terrain, and isolation of the winter months transformed the battlefield into a different kind of arena, one that tested both the strength of the castle's design and the endurance of its defenders. The very location of a castle was a primary factor in its defense during the winter. Castles were often built on high ground or within strategic landscapes, such as hilltops, cliffs, or near rivers, to provide a commanding view of the surrounding territory. This elevated position allowed defenders to spot enemy movements from a distance, giving them a critical advantage in preparing for an attack. However, the same strategic positioning that made the castle a bastion of defense in times of war also created challenges during the winter. The terrain, while advantageous for spotting invaders, could become treacherous. Ice and snow often transformed pathways into slippery, impassable obstacles, making it difficult for both defenders and attackers to move swiftly. In some cases, this could slow down the arrival of reinforcements or prevent the quick evacuation of civilians and supplies in the event of an emergency. The remote locations of many castles meant that they were cut off from neighboring towns or villages, and the snow-blocked roads became a critical vulnerability. The presence of a moat was another defining feature of the castle's defense system. Moats, which were often filled with water or, in some cases, intentionally left to freeze over during the winter, created an additional obstacle for potential attackers. When frozen, moats became a treacherous barrier that could either impede the attacker's approach or be used as a tactical advantage by the defenders. The enemy's attempts to cross a frozen moat could leave them exposed to arrows, crossbows, and boiling liquids poured from the battlements. However, this icy moat also posed a challenge for the castle's defenders, who had to carefully monitor its condition. If the ice was too thin, it could collapse under the weight of attackers or even a stray horse, turning a potential advantage into a deadly trap for both sides. The castle's gates, towers, and walls were its primary defenses against an attack, and they were designed to withstand the harshest of winter conditions. The gates, often made of heavy wood and reinforced with iron, were the main entry points for both legitimate visitors and would-be invaders. These gates were heavily fortified and designed to be easily defended. However, winter weather could take its toll on these structures, especially the wooden parts. Freezing rain, snow, and ice could weaken the wood, making it more susceptible to damage. Defenders needed to ensure that the gates were properly maintained and reinforced throughout the winter months. The towers, typically placed at strategic points around the castle, served as lookout posts and as positions from which defenders could repel attackers with arrows, stones, and boiling oil. These towers were also vulnerable to the winter elements, as ice and snow could accumulate on their roofs and battlements, making them slippery and potentially dangerous for those stationed there. But while the castle's walls and towers provided crucial protection, the real challenge for defenders during the winter months was not simply repelling attackers, it was surviving the isolation and scarcity that came with the season. The fortress, while offering a stronghold against the enemy, was also a confinement. Once the roads and paths leading to the castle were blocked by snow, it was much harder for reinforcements or supplies to reach the defenders.